Welcome, listeners.
Assalamu alaikum.
I'm Mike.
And I'm John.
And this is Some Marginalia. Today, we're going to be visiting a garden, one that is somewhat poorly attended by the scholars that make their residence therein from time to time and lay down some rocks and some plants as markers within this space. And our intent today was to pace around that garden. We can call it the Garden of Causality, in kind of a way that maybe outlines why we want to make some marginalia, mostly for ourselves, I think, just to organize our own thoughts, but hopefully they will be of some use to others, or at least some interest to others. And as we know, there's no better way to learn that you're wrong than by being wrong publicly on the internet. John, I think you had a whole bunch of passages written down that were kind of...
Yeah, marginalia, if you will.
Yeah. and I think, you know, do you happen to have the Shen Kuo quote handy? Because that one really struck me.
Yeah, we can start there.
Yeah.
I do feel like when I found that and sent it to you, that somehow this all kind of germinated from that.
Yeah, I think so. I when I read it, let's read it and see what's there.
So this is from Shen Kuo. He was he a Tang Dynasty scholar? I want to say that's when he was a Song Dynasty, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. And he wrote a massive compendium of just everything he ever thought about called the Dream Pool Essays, while he was sequestered away in his estate. It ended up being, I guess, a pretty important explication of Chinese science, and it ends up getting quoted just numerous times by Needham in his magnum opus History of Science in China. But anyway, so the quote is about his roughly Taoist conception, I guess, of things, and our attempts to apprehend and reason about phenomena. And he says, "Those in the world who speak of the regularities underlying the phenomena seems manage to apprehend their crude traces. But these regularities have their very subtle aspect, which those who rely on mathematical astronomy cannot know of. Still, even these are nothing more than traces. As for the spiritual processes described in the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, that, when they are stimulated, penetrate every situation in the realm, mere traces have nothing to do with them. The spiritual state at which foreknowledge is attained can hardly be sought through changes, of which in any case only the cruder sort are attainable. What I have called the subtlest aspect of these traces. Those who discuss the celestial bodies attempt to know by depending on mathematical astronomy, but astronomy is nothing more than the outcome of conjecture."
I mean, that's perfect. You know, it's who needs Hume?
Yeah, I have always wondered to what extent, if we were just more aware of things written and talked about prior to early modernity, would it have been pretty nothing new under the sun, so to speak.
The thing that really struck me was the references to mathematical astronomy and the sense in which, whatever knowledge is generated that way is, the outcome of conjecture. So, he actually gets that, statements about, astrophysical models, whatever they might be, however, sophisticated or primitive they may have been, that those are statements about conjectures, about models, and not about reality itself, right? And this is still very confusing for people in the physical sciences today. And here you have this Song Dynasty scholar who's he just he knows it, right? He gets it.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this a lot because when he talks about what's described in the I Ching, we probably will have to talk about the I Ching some other time, but it is interesting that I feel like what he's talking about, or what you could say maybe his quote from the I Ching is talking about, is like the ghaib, like it's the unseen, which is going to come up a lot in the Islamic discussions about this, just in terms of like when we're talking about, like you say, astrophysical models, we're talking about something apprehensible, but then there's the unseen realm, which is, I think the Islamic kind of view of it is that it's not apprehensible, like we can't perceive that, and that's been explicitly said so in the Quran and other places, that like the human soul, for instance, or the subtle lordly essence, the ruh of knowledge you have been given but a little. In a way, I think maybe we'll draw this out a bit more, but it does, I think what you're saying, there's a subtle but important difference between something that we can abstractly model and then the totality of reality, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. And I was thinking along the same lines actually today. I was just, in preparation for recording this, flipping through some Nicholas Rescher that I hadn't looked at for quite some time. And one of the things that he mentioned, so this is in the book Cognitive Harmony. So Rescher is a philosopher of science who's, one of his interests is in completing the system, right? Like he wants a completely, if not monolithic, then at least internally consistent view of reality. I think that's a reasonable summary of a huge program of research in philosophy. But he says, so proceeding in this spirit, various schools of epistemic minimalism go about posting signposts that put all risk of engaging larger issues off limits. Such theorists turn Occam's razor into Robespierre's guillotine. Their tumbrils carry off a wide variety of victims. Sets in the philosophy of mathematics, abstracta in semantics, unobservable entities in the philosophy of physics, dispositional theses in the philosophy of language, obligations that reach beyond the requisites of prudence in moral theory, and so on. So we have, in particular, there unobservable entities in the philosophy of physics. And so, Rescher is talking about why we might want to go beyond the kind of very narrow epistemic localism or minimalist type of approach that you might expect to find kind of in an undergraduate classroom where people are learning physics or biology or what have you. And clearly one of the problems is that we literally have no theory of the unseen or of the hidden, things that are in principle or even just in practice not accessible to instrumental sciences, right? So if you don't have the instruments to detect some phenomenon or detect some existent, or it's in principle not possible for you to do so, it's just completely excluded from consideration.
Yeah, which it would be hard to differentiate that from, because I think like you said, with the unseen objects in physics, those are kind of the creations of conjecture based upon necessity for completing a formal description, right?
Right.
And so it's not any number of those things which have been posited and are necessary for physics as we do it today to make sense. It's not like those are empirically justified or founded in any way. It's sort of given some set of axioms and these things being held to be true, these other things just must be true. And they're kind of from a process of invention maybe, or creation, a creative use of reason.
Yeah.
But not by any means apodictically certain to be real, but I think kind of how it's treated, because we all just tend to forget that this is the process by which these things are being laid out or built,
Yeah, and in this very constrained theoretical environment that necessarily kind of brackets the kinds of things that get to be called real, right? So, and I mean, I think we should probably say that, like, I think both of us are realists about something, right? But scientific realists we maybe are not, right? So in other words, if you're looking at a track in a cloud chamber, there's a difference between saying, okay, something's there and like we can model it, and saying that's a Cartesian point mass, with the following characteristics that are what goes into the model. And I think a lot of the problems that we kind of have both encountered in our learning and investigation over the last few years are basically about this kind of thing, right? Because it's enormously confusing when someone takes a model to be actually real, and that's the normal kind of habit or disposition that you're inculcated with if you have some kind of scientific, or we can call it like frequentist statistical background. It's the model, in many cases is just literally directly conflated with reality. I think it might be useful here just to add. So this is a rather long passage from Edwin Jaynes, who is a very significant Bayesian theorist, who unfortunately I think he died before some of the later advancements that maybe we can talk about later had occurred. But in any case, he had a very clear sense of what goes wrong here. He's concerned about frequentist statistics tending to write off real effects that are there, which is kind of interesting, because the typical obsession today is with avoiding overfitting. He's kind of worried that actually these orthodox quote unquote statisticians are failing to see effects that are there. So he says, this orthodox reluctance to see causal effects, even when they are real, has another psychological danger, because it eventually becomes extrapolated into a belief in the existence of stochastic processes in which no causes at all are operative, and probability itself is the only real physical phenomenon. When the search for any causal relation whatever is deprecated and discouraged, scientific progress is brought to a standstill. Belief in the existence of stochastic processes in the real world, i.e. that the property of being stochastic rather than deterministic is a real physical property of a process that exists independently of human information, is another example of the mind projection fallacy, attributing one's own ignorance to nature instead. The current literature of probability theory is full of claims to the effect that a Gaussian random process, quote unquote, is fully determined by its first and second moments. So, just to explain there, so a Gaussian random process, he's saying someone is modeling the outcomes of some process, like for instance population distribution of a variable like height with a normal distribution, right? So the typical bell curve that we're all familiar with. And so the first and second moments are the mean and the standard deviation of that model, of the normal model of the outcomes. Okay, so he's saying, the literature is full of claims of people who are saying this process is defined entirely by the parameterization of the model I'm using to describe it, right? So he says if it were made clear that this is only the defining property for an abstract mathematical model, there could be no objection to this. But it is always presented in verbiage that implies that one is describing an objectively true property of a real physical process. To one who believes such a thing literally, there could be no motivation to investigate the causes more deeply than noting the first and second moments, and so the real processes at work might never be discovered. Okay, so this is sort of the end point. This is the collapse of this kind of mentality, right? Where you're taking what Shen Kuo is calling like the outcomes of conjecture and saying, actually, these are the only real things. And because my conjectures involve random variables, that are being simulated on a computer, the process itself is random and has no causes.
Yeah. It is really interesting how it is like a means by which to prevent basically any discovery or understanding from taking place.
Yeah, and I think this is something that, it certainly would have been surprising to me, like, 10 years ago, as a younger biology graduate student with, a very glib understanding of scientific metaphysics, right? Like we're talking, you can get through a biology undergraduate program with like Wikipedia to your understanding of like what empiricism is and like what it is you're doing, right? So, for me, that would have been very surprising, right? Because it seems like, and I think this is one of the things that Brian Van Norden is kind of pushing back against in his work is, we have this like a very aphoristic, like artistic kind of Chinese rendition of, an affective state rather than like a formal argument. Right? And so it seems like mystifying in some way, like he's arguing for, some type of like mystical experiential knowledge that's only accessible to an elite or something like that. But what, it turns out that in fact he's doing is trying to prevent these people from like having a worldview that will ultimately collapse in on itself and into this kind of like causeless morass of just, random quantum foam or whatever it is that people talk about now.
Right. I think it'll be really interesting as we kind of move through some of the stuff that I've collected, because the extent to which these questions were dealt with, I think, is surprising, and how applicable I think a lot of it is to what we're talking about today. Because I would imagine like Shen Kuo, when he's talking about the processes described in the I Ching, it has to, like song metaphysics, is probably kind of what's being referenced there, and it's just something to the extent of like under the redefinition of these terms, or like under the semantic shift maybe that they underwent during those times, like the Li ends up being something like the principle is usually how it's translated, and this is essentially essence or something like that. It's kind of a difficult concept because it's monist at some point. Like there's Li is merely one vantage point, I think they would say, on basically the one thing. And there's also Qi, which I recently encountered a translation of it as psychophysical stuff, which I think that's actually pretty good. Like someone was saying they hated it because it's not standard, but I think it does a better job of describing Qi than just saying it's like matter or something, because it's not merely matter. I think the psychic component of it is pretty important when you look at a lot of the ways that Qi is talked about and the various moments of the Chinese tradition. But so essentially Qi and Li are always in some kind of action, and that interaction is sort of like all of manifested existence. And I think maybe kind of what you could get out of Shen Kuo is he's saying like this is not a statement on the level of like physics, so to speak, or it is like they would have classified it as physics, but they didn't understand physics like we did. But I think from our point of view, it's clearly like these are metaphysical ideas that are not somehow like you can't isolate and examine them. They're like the underlying structure of how life is thought to like happen and exist, or like all of the world, and that if you understand and can apprehend that, then you can know the future, which I guess would be the claim for like doing I Ching divination or whatever. But this podcast probably has to side against that claim.
Well, it's an interesting one though. In any case, that has direct parallels to the kind of discourse around causal explanation in explanation theory now, right? Because the only let's say, like, real way that we have to determine whether or not a causal explanation is any good is whether it seems to allow you to predict and control a natural system. Right, so it's in some way, I mean, it's not that different from the geomancer walking around, with various kinds of ideas about how he's going to alter or predict or alter, the flow of events or what have you. And in many cases, the predictive and control faculties of those explanations are not anywhere near as sophisticated as people, I think, tend to assume. Certainly that's the case in biology, where most models are basically just like unevaluated, even just in a model comparison context. Like, you just looking at, like, is this explanation better than another one, an alternative, a simpler one, whatever. Like, that rarely happens, much less some development in an industrial, like, process control context or something like that, where you actually are able to predict and control outcomes in some economically meaningful way, right? Which, like, when you see a whole category of explanations and it's like nobody is using these to make money, like, probably they don't work that well. I mean, at least maybe, right? So we have this kind of, like, we still have this, like, landscape of, like, magicians and soothsayers and people uttering prophecy and doing different kinds of lot casting, right? Because, I mean, a lot of the random variable stuff, I mean, is basically ends up being lot casting in the biblical sense, right? Like, to resolve issues, to make policies, whatever.
Yeah, one of the, like, thoughts that really preoccupied me for a while was, like, in what sense is the modern, like, numerical statistical project different from astrology, and is it different from astrology,
right?
And, like, how are we to understand this stuff? And I feel like you've gotten maybe a lot closer to an answer than when I first started wondering about it. This could actually be, if you want, we could just start talking about we've got some opinions on astrology from Al-Ghazali, Sina, Ibn Taymiyyah, and then Qayyim al-Jawziyah.
Yeah.
All roughly kind of treating it within this, I feel like it's a few 100-year span between them all, not too long. But kind of in giving their fatwa about the phenomenon, a lot more is revealed, I think, about kind of how they're seeing the world. So first we'll go to Al-Ghazali, who writes in the Kitab al-Ilm, the Book of Knowledge, which is the first book of the Ihya Ulumuddin, Revival of the Religious Sciences, which is sort of like his magnum opus. He says in a chapter, an elucidation on the reason some knowledge is blameworthy. Therefore, preoccupation in the pursuit and practice of astrology, and that which resembles it, is a hazardous undertaking, an immersion in a sea of ignorance without any benefit whatsoever. Whatever has been decreed by God will be, there is no circumventing it. This is in contrast to the pursuit of medicine. There is a great need, and in medicine the majority of proofs are based on what is observable. It is in contrast as well to the interpretation of dreams, which, though it does comprise conjecture, delves into one part of the 46 parts of prophecy, and there is no hazard in it. The third reason that knowledge may become blameworthy is that it is immersion in a field in which the seeker is not firmly established. This is intrinsically blameworthy, similar to learning the minute details of a discipline before its evident essentials, or the hidden before the explicit, or like inquiry into the subtleties of divine reality, for it is the philosophers and theologians who strive for these without being firmly established in them, when in fact only the prophets and the saints have become established in this knowledge in its entirety or certain of its branches. It is therefore obligatory to prevent people from inquiring into these matters and turn them to that what law speaks of, for in that there is sufficiency for those who would be successful. How many individuals have become immersed in the sciences to their own detriment? Had he not immersed himself therein, his circumstances, where religion is concerned, would have been superior to where he finally ended up. No one disagrees that knowledge may harm certain people in the same manner that the meat of certain birds and varieties of fine sweets may harm a breastfeeding infant. In fact, in many cases, an individual's ignorance of certain matters benefits him. And then in another part here, he goes more in depth into the nature of astrology. Its pursuit has been prohibited based on the following three rationales. One of them is that it is detrimental for most people, for if they were taught that phenomenal events occur as results associated with the movement of the stars, it would occur to them that the stars were the ultimate cause behind the events, and that they were divine entities dictating worldly affairs, because they are sublime heavenly substances. Awe of them would be magnified in the hearts, and a heart would remain turned toward them. They would perceive good and evil as that which is hoped for or dreaded, deriving from them, thus effacing the remembrance of God from the heart. A weak-minded person has his vision restricted to the intermediary causes of events, whereas the well-versed scholar is fully aware that the sun, moon, and stars all submit to the command of God. The example of the perception of the weak-minded person's conclusion that the light of the sun is due to the sun's rising is similar to the example of the ant, if it were given an intellect and found itself on a sheet of paper looking at the black ink as it traced words. It would believe that words arose from the pen. Its perception does not extend to the awareness of the fingers, then from that to which the hand, then from that motive behind he who sets the hand in motion, then from there to the capable intent of the scribe, and from him to the creator of the hand, the ability to write, and the intention. The perception of the majority of people is limited to the immediate causes of events. They are disconnected from perception of the one who causes all causes. This is one rationale behind the prohibition of pursuing the field of astrology. The second is that judgments derived from astrology are pure conjecture. Nothing is apprehended in specific cases, neither with certainty nor probability. Judgments based on it are judgments based on ignorance. Therefore, condemnation of astrology is because it is considered ignorance, not knowledge. According to what is said, astronomy was a miracle accorded to the prophet Idris by God, when knowledge faded away and disappeared. Those events accord with, and this only rarely, the accurate prediction of the astrologer are nothing but happenstance. For he may come to be apprised of certain secondary causes for which the final result is only realized through multiple conditions, the realities, or haqa'iq, of which a human being has no means of understanding. If it should come to pass that God decrees the remaining causes, the accuracy will result, and should he not decree the causes, then he, the astrologer, will be inaccurate. This case resembles the conjecture of a person that it will rain today whenever he sees clouds gathering and descending from the mountains, and in his mind he supposes it to be the case. However, the day may become hot and sunny and the clouds may dissipate, or it may occur otherwise, for clouds alone are not sufficient to bring rain, and the remaining causes are not to be comprehended. Likewise, there is conjecture of the mariner, reliant on his experience of the winds, that his ship will be out of harm's way on its voyage. Those winds, however, have subtle causes that he does not grasp, so at times his prediction is accurate and at times inaccurate. It is for this rationale that one who is strong in his faith and conviction forbids the practice of astrology. The third rationale behind forbidding astrology is that there is no benefit in it. The least that can be said of its traits is that it is immersing oneself in superfluous matters that do not concern one, and it is a waste of one's life, which is the most precious possession a human being has, without accruing benefit, which is the epitome of loss. The messenger of God ﷺ passed by a man around whom people had gathered, and he asked, "What is this?" To which they responded, "Knowledgeable man." He asked, "Of what?" They said, "Of poetry and the family lines of the Arabs." To which he ﷺ responded, "Knowledge that does not benefit, and ignorance that does no harm." The Messenger of God ﷺ also said, "Knowledge is constituted in a precise verse, an established sunnah, or a just obligatory act." I feel like there's a lot there.
Definitely. I mean, we can maybe start with the last section there. The reason this is important is because you don't want to waste your life doing astrology, right? Especially if you don't know it and you think that, what you're doing is on a different plane. Imam Ghazali seems to point to observables, the use of certainty and probability rather than mere conjecture. How would we go about distinguishing these things, right? I guess he offers these criteria, right, that we have observables and that we're dealing. I suppose there's some question about what he means by probability here as well, because I don't think it was all that well developed at that time, maybe in linguistics more than anywhere else.
Yeah, we might need to have recourse to the Arabic to really get into that, I think.
Yeah, so we'll maybe just bracket that. But in any case, we don't want to waste our time with this stuff. And you can clearly see the sort of Ash'ari impulse here to compress all causal explanations into the first cause and the effect, right? In other words, any causal explanation that doesn't ultimately point you back to God, the first cause, capital N nature, if you really must, is of this kind of astrological class, right? Like, it's just a waste of time. It's not doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah, it was interesting that he does not directly refute the existence of creational causation or something, though. He goes into the fact that, and this is something Ibn Taymiyyah is going to bring up later, it's not that there is no observation and then the formulation of some kind of prediction or whatever. It's simply that of what's available to you is too little. But he could have just as easily said none of that matters, everything you see is constantly arising and falling in and out of existence every moment. Thus, the only causation is directly linked to God's, constant bringing us back into existence after letting us fall away, which would be the sort of, I think, basic Ash'ari idea. But it's interesting that he kind of maintains this sort of modified Aristotelian account, which I think, we'll be able to talk about it a lot more over the course of this, but I did notice that he didn't really cast that aside.
Yeah.
It was strikingly similar to Shen Kuo in some ways as well. That, I think that really got me thinking, did they all know something despite being separated by hundreds of years and miles?
I kind of wonder if it's just after a while you've had enough contact with causal explanation users to know that most of them don't know what's going on, right? That most people who are offering local causal models for the prediction and control of some phenomenon don't know what's going on, right? So for the most part, this is going to be a waste of time, and in these kind of limited exceptions, medicine or whatever, where you have an observable and you're able to observe in kind of human comprehensible terms enough of the totality to actually be able to move beyond these kinds of silly conjectures, right? A model with too few variables to represent the system at all, right? Because you don't have enough. You're just observing the clouds coming up, down off the mountain, right? You don't have any. You're not adding any information about wind speed. You're not adding any information about humidity or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's a consistent theme with Ghazali, I think, and maybe these others as well, of kind of maintaining an intellectual humility. One of the things that he brings up, it might be in the Incoherence, I'm not sure, but I do remember him talking about how people, let's say you're really great at Ptolemaic astronomy, that often leads people to then think that they are really just experts at other things that they have not delved that deeply into because of their accomplishments in one branch. And that there's kind of a a religious psychological critique going on, which is always been pretty important to, I think, a lot of his work. which is that you can't really talk about this without talking about self-deception and the ways in which, you know, we make ourselves feel as though we have this great understanding of things. And I think this is kind of especially at the heart of astrology, is like, you've spent all this time studying, you know, like the like mathematical model tables for like the astronomical movements of things, and are trying to like make predictions. You've probably, like Causality is saying, like sunk a lot of your life into this. And I think with that has to come like a certain level of, like, you just have to believe at that point that it means something, that it's real, and that whatever, maybe like your predictions are wrong, but that's not proof of the fact that this is random. Yeah. Maybe a better sense of this word, but maybe like you just have to do better next time, or like you weren't working with the best data set, but you'll get a better, you know, there's a certain kind of like inability to see when something is false, I guess. But we can move on to, so Ibn Taymiyyah had a few fatwas about astrology and other things that were translated by Yahya Micho, who I believe has been and still is at Hartford Seminary. He translated, I think, 2 of the fatwas like in total in an article, which was really nice to be able to go through and read, and I've culled a few things out of them. They won't all directly relate, but that's the nature of marginalia. So we'll just hop into the middle of one here. So we're talking about like, what is an eclipse? Eclipses come up all the time in the discussions around astrology and like kind of the meaning of astral phenomena. And the eclipse is one that always freaked people out. And you would get a lot of astrological type activity surrounding the attempt to explain them, as well as predict them. And Ibn Taymiyyah writes, the fact that the Prophet informs us that God frightens his servants by such a phenomenon, an eclipse, clearly establishes that it may be a cause of some torment that he sends down onto us, similarly to strong storm winds, and that only happens because God made it a cause of what he sends down to the earth. Whoever means by saying that the stars have an influence, that which is known by the senses and by these other affairs, this is true. God has, however, commanded the various acts of worship that repel from us whatever evil is sent by this, by which he's referring to the instruction that we receive from the Prophet to pray the eclipse player, give alms and free slaves, maybe some other things too, whenever an eclipse happens, as a way of protecting yourself from the evil which comes with it. Concerning the causes of good and evil, this is the tradition to follow. In the case of the apparent causes of the good, the servant accomplishes some of the righteous actions, because of which God brings about the good, and in the case of evil, some of the acts of worship, because of which God repels from him the evil. As for what is hidden of the causes, the servant is not commanded to take upon himself to know that. That was interesting.
Yeah.
In that, like, the eclipse being a cause of evil is kind of like affirmed as a real possibility that you shouldn't discount.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, the eclipse prayer has some function, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because now we're getting into, like, I mean, I would say, and I think that probably this is kind of where the literature is at today. Like, Ibn Taymiyyah is definitely like a rationalist in some sense, whereas he's usually portrayed, I think, by people who don't have much familiarity with him, honestly, as like a literalist, like a textual literalist, where it's like the only things that I can affirm are just what's literally in the Hadith or the Quran. But you're reading through this is one of the first places where I saw that he was actually like a far more dynamic and like interesting thinker in that way. There's a lot of things that are kind of surprising about what he says. And so when he says, whoever means by saying that the stars have an influence, that which is known by the senses and by these other affairs, this is true. It's kind of like an empiricism, I would say, which there was that Whale Halak translation of his book Against the Logicians, which I think is supposedly like a text which I've read some of it, but I haven't read all of it, so I don't really comment on it. But it's supposed to set up like this idea that Ibn Taymiyyah was kind of a nominalist and that he rejected the idea of like essence, logical essence, because it had, I think, a lot of people were making metaphysical claims about essences that he found to be particularly dangerous and in error. But he was still engaging, I think, with the philosophical tradition in a way where, like, it's just an obvious use of reason. It's not anti-philosophical or anything like that. And I think that we've, like, the Western reception of a lot of this stuff, like, it's the standard account of, like, Ghazali destroyed philosophy.
Yeah.
And it never recovered. It's sad. Or whatever. And, like, the idea that you can say, oh, these people are theologians and these people are philosophers, like, there's a case to be made for that distinction, I think, like, in terms of like, endogenously or whatever. Like, there is the word philosopha, you know, and the mutakalimun, you know, like, in Arabic, used at that time to distinguish different pursuits. But I think if you're talking about a, like, modern Western pursuit of philosophy, and the fact that, like, we don't really have any problem talking about Thomas Aquinas as a philosopher, I think really kind of, for me, makes a lot of that questionable.
Yeah, there's no question that a big chunk of that narrative is because both Ghazali and Taymiyyah stake out, at least rhetorically, like anti-Greek positions, right? And so
right.
You know, it's basically just like, okay, well, if you're against the Greeks, you're anti-rationalist, like you're not engaging in proper philosophy at this point. You know, that kind of prejudice is there. But you know, maybe it's worth mentioning some things about the context here, but you know, why are they even talking about astrology? Is because it was completely pervasive in their societies, right? So they're very concerned about the impact that this kind of thinking has on, you know, not just like the affairs of like common ignorant people, the awam, whatever. They're concerned about, like, you know, astrologers going to the Sultan with some, you know, dire prediction and just very bad things happening as a result of the state taking these kinds of things on board. You know, it's high stakes. So there's very good reason for them to be addressing this. And it is definitely not anti-rationalist, you know, and if anything, I think Taymiyyah is upset with the extent to which the Ash'ari kind of, I don't know if it's right to call it a consensus, but like this sort of elite Ash'ari opinion can't really address local causes. Like in the Ash'ari school, basically, you know, to offer a causal explanation for some phenomenon is to miss the semiotic content of the phenomenon. In other words, the fire does not burn, you know, paper because of some property of the fire. It burns it because God decrees it is so, and he's doing that in order to direct your inner state, your inner sight to his majesty, or to make you grateful for warmth and for light and for the ability to cook food and, you know, these kinds of things. So you're just like, when you're engaging in causal explanations, you're basically kind of like missing the point. And for Imam Taymiyyah, that's clearly, you know, just an empty kind of construct. Like, you can't do anything with that. You're never going to, you know, convince the people who are using, you know, let's say defective local causal explanations from astrology that they ought to just kind of like throw up their hands and say, you know, well, it's all from God's will and like we're fine, right? Like, there's still going to be reasoning causally. So, you know, you have to engage at that level and determine like what is actually a better way of thinking about this.
Yeah, it is. It's one of the big questions is like, what form of causal reasoning is like basically the province of charlatans, and what is the like really eminently useful and pragmatic thing that we're already have been doing since before we had invented these terms for it.
Right.
And like extensions of that, which are of some benefit and like necessary. And it's sort of what we're, I think, getting into. Since you brought it up, I'll read ahead a bit. We haven't gotten to Ibn al-Qayyim yet, but in one of the articles about some of his thinking on this subject, the author gives a good kind of like context for these times. So, born in Mamluk, Damascus in 1292, Ibn al-Qayyim spoke for the literate Arabic-reading Sunni Ummah at a time when Islamdom was emerging from or undergoing a series of threatening blows. The Crusades, the Mongol destruction of Baghdad, and the Abbasid Caliphate. Mamluk political turmoil that was concomitant with the continuing loss of international transport trade to the Venetians, inflationary periods during which Syrians and Egyptians were reported to have eaten dogs and donkeys in the streets, periodic visitations of the Black Plague when people dropped like flies, and a terrifying earthquake that so shook Mount Muqattam in Cairo that the people in distant Damascus thought that the Yawm al-Qiyamah, Judgment Day, had come. To this could be added the continuing loss of Islamic lands to the Spanish conquistadors, an unmitigated catastrophe for Ibn Khaldun, writing less than a generation after Ibn al-Qayyim. These disasters formed a large part of the psychological background to the perceived general malaise besetting Islam in the 14th century. As in later Hellenistic times, and perhaps our own, people facing political and economic decline, social insecurity, and a threatening host of impending disasters found refuge in the occult. Ulama, with Ibn al-Qayyim taking a leading position, saw the occultic sciences as so many pantheist demons eating away at Islam's spiritual innards, where God's undivided omnipotence was parceled out to stars and birds, and elemental nature was charged with a transmutational potency that appeared to be self-sustained. Far from being a radical Hanbali fundamentalist, Ibn al-Qayyim was a jurist and theologian who possessed a competent knowledge of science and philosophy, in addition to an inclination towards mysticism. And through his career as a defender of Sunni purity against an inner threat of intellectual perversion parallels that of al-Ghazali's. It was actually a pretty good little summary. Really, I never in my mind had just all of those events together quite in that way, but it's fairly stark, I think.
Yeah, me either. It is nice to get another perspective besides, Imam Taymiyyah, father of terrorism, right? Like,
yeah.
If we actually have a look at the historical context, it's a lot more clear why he was writing so stridently, right? I mean, he's not doing this because he doesn't like, housewives getting their horoscopes told, right? Like, there are real problems with his society, and lots of that has to do with the way that events are being interpreted and the way that people model things causally, in their minds.
Right. And I think that, as one reads these things, it becomes clearer, like, the reality of things versus the portrayal of the reality by certain, I guess, primarily Western scholars with an interest in making tendentious claims.
Yeah.
So we can go back here and keep going through Ibn Taymiyyah and kind of see where we're at. So he goes on to say that in the Sahih, it is established about the Prophet, God bless him and grant him peace, that it was said to him, "There are among us people who frequent the diviners," and he says, "They are nothing." And they say, "O messenger of God, they sometimes tell us something and it comes true." The messenger of God, God bless him and grant him peace, then said, "This utterance of the truth, it is the genie who hears it and he who puts it in the ear of his friend." That's some marginalia. That's pretty fun though. And we could say like, I doubt if you're listening to this you would say this, but someone might say, like, these are sort of quaint, superstitious things to believe or whatever, but I think the truth of it is that, like we've been saying, there obviously is an unseen realm no one denies that. Like, we established like pretty early on, like contemporary physicists don't deny that. They have their own subset of things that are unseen, and I would imagine they could say it's part of our kind of, like, to quote Dagoth, our grand and intoxicating innocence, that we have kind of imagined that that's not true. You know what I like when we're talking about, like, the fact that jinn are like putting truth mixed with lies into the ears of the astrologers, who then give it to the people. Like, even if you were someone who was kind of a skeptic, I feel like you could get to a point where you would be forced to admit that that's not necessarily a bad description of the observable phenomena coming out of those activities socially.
Yeah. Look at Twitter. There's clearly jinn active on Twitter.
Yeah.
I think it's helpful. Like, if I was talking to myself, as a sort of callow young atheist, probably what I would say is you have to understand these things as nominating categories of causes, and the specific content of it is less important than that the nomination of, like, let's say jinn or angels or whatever as metaphysical existence denotes an agent, right? Something that participates in the agency of God, basically, in some way, whether that's, we could say deterministically with the angels who are rigidly carrying out the will of God as this kind of intermediary substance, if you want, between the kind of unchanging essence of God and the changing. I mean, I'm not gonna commit to essence here, but you know what I mean, like the unchanging dot, I suppose we say in Arabic, of God, and the changing, substance of the world. Yeah, so, and in the case of jinn, you're denoting an agent that's much like us, but is in the unseen, right? So in the Ash'ari kind of perspective on free will, which I think Ibn Taymiyyah wouldn't take too much issue with, we petition God for acts, right? So our volitional acts are nonetheless in some sense carried out by angels, but they have been petitioned for by our souls participating in the agency which underlies everything.
Yeah. No, I think that's a pretty important point to make, because, well, we'll just say that, like, thinking in that way, it's obviously not dissimilar to what we are already all doing all the time as moderns or whatever, like the ways in which we think and do assign, like, these, or like the way in which we think in terms of agency all the time, and like biology, I think you would agree, is like a huge example of this, but then like outright deny any actual like existing agency. But we're then really at a loss to explain all of the language we just used to describe something, because it all is pretty heavily like agency.
Yeah, right. And I mean, so someone who's listening to this who has some biological background might think, well, yes, of course, we use agential or functional language as a shorthand for something which is always reducible to dumb material causes, right? Like just deterministic, mechanical kind of unfolding of this complex system. I think really that's not tenable anymore. So Jacques Monod, the great French molecular biologist and microbiologist, was famously, just horrified by the presence of teleological language in biology. Like to say that a heart has a purpose, right? Like the purpose of the heart is to pump blood, is like totally unacceptable as an explanation, either for what the heart is doing, or for the appearance of the heart in the first place, right? Like he wants to like totally reject final causality, and we've kind of inherited Monod's like great horror. I mean, it was shared certainly by many people of his generation, But I think by this point, it's very clear that like if you don't have some kind of idea of like what a function is, you're kind of dead in the water as far as like a biological explanation goes. Like you're not only are you not going to be able to communicate with anyone, even if you believe it's like kind of a shorthand for something that could be reduced to like a mechanistic physical explanation or physical chemical explanation or whatever. You're actually cutting yourself off from huge chunks of the empirical literature, which are not posed in terms that you can reduce to sort of Monod's idea of the cell as a cybernetic factory, right? And so, I mean, we'll probably get back to cybernetics later, but the point is that this kind of idea is now increasingly being abandoned, I would say. The growth of the biosemiotic literature is proof of that. And you really need, I mean, if you are a completely secular person, if you have no explanation for agency, for the emergence of complex structures, or for function, nothing that incorporates or explains in what sense organisms have a final cause that they develop towards, a telos that they develop towards. Because development fundamentally is about convergent complexity, right? Like the development of individuals of a species is not divergent in the way that evolutionary theory produces with multiple species, right? Like within a species, we have convergent development on a single endpoint. So this calls for a teleological explanation. If you don't have one, you're simply leaving out most of the interesting stuff in biology, frankly. So
yeah, it's almost, I would rather be blind than see that.
No, for sure. And I mean, I think you definitely see that all over the literature. It's like an intense squeamishness about this, and people, I think, they want to naturalize this as another physical law in many cases, right? So you have some kind of like neg entropy principle out of like Schrodinger, or I think Richard Swenson wants to have like a fourth law of thermodynamics that does something very similar, that forces you towards increases in complexity over time, this kind of thing. And so that's one way to think about that if you're like truly squeamish about the idea of agency or something like that. But I mean, the critiques that have been made by now against the standard kind of neo-Darwinian synthetic account of evolutionary theory are just devastating, right? Like if fundamentally, evolutionary theory relies upon agents. Like the striving agent is presupposed by the theory. It's not explained by the theory. If you don't have motile agents, then you simply don't have the Malthusian growth curves that are taken for granted as producing the selective pressure for many of the most basic kinds of evolutionary scenarios that we would model, right? So, I mean, there are all kinds of problems with this. Like you simply need to have some account of this. Whether or not it's theistic doesn't really matter. And if it is theistic, then you shouldn't get complacent about it either, right? Like I do think Ibn Taymiyyah's account or a criticism of the Ash'ari school is correct, right? Like this is not cognitively active for anyone who has to trade in causal explanations, right? They'll say, oh yeah, God's doing everything, and then they'll go back to astrology because they still need to make predictions, they still need to make decisions.
Yeah, and I would say that it really does seem like the point of formulating these ideas in the Ash'ari or other schools was primarily polemic, and the need was felt mainly to debate, I guess initially probably Christians and maybe Jews or other people who wanted to make counterclaims to like Islamic understandings of things, or just for the fact that like a Muslim would have to eventually encounter people dealing with the world like on a like a peripatetic philosophical basis or something like that, and they would need to be able to like think in those terms and respond to those things. And there is philosophical activity, as we know, going on in the Islamic world, where you had people trying to do interesting, like syncretistic type things, and it all felt like it needed to be addressed with some sort of firm statement of like, as close as language can get to the truth, which I think, you know, it's pretty widely agreed that like Ash'ari theology is not a description of reality, but it's just as close as you can get to one aspect of it to prevent people from moving beyond the bounds of what is acceptable, which I think is probably, like, you know, that's a really specific function for a body of thought to have, and I think maybe it's good to understand it in those terms too.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's been pointed out by I'm going to mess this. It might have been George Makdisi, I'm not sure. But you know, one of the greats has pointed out that you know, quite some time ago, that the Ash'ari kind of school was only really one level of discourse that Imam Ash'ari actually offered. So, I think it was, you know, dubbed the two ways of Ash'ari or something like that. And the idea is basically that, you know, this was quite a rarefied type of discourse that is specifically really intended as almost a psychological balm or treatment for like people who had OD'd on causality. You know, like, it's not a scientific function that this is serving, right? Like, this has a specific intellectual function, and it's not being offered to everyone. Like, if you went to learn like the basics of theology at a madrasa that was, you know, attended by Ash'ari scholars, they probably wouldn't mention any of this to you unless they thought it was something that like you would benefit from spiritually, right? Like, you have real problems like with the idea of efficient causality, and like, you know, if you accept efficient causality, which is to say that, you know, like, perhaps things are effective in and of themselves, they're causes in and of themselves, you know, or you're treating them that way in your explanations. You know, if you're really disturbed by that, in other words, like, idolatry seems like true and real to you, and you feel like, you know, you should be like giving thanks to the fire for cooking your food, then like here's kind of a balm for your heart, right? Like, God's doing everything, you know, and it's from his power that this happens. And I mean, I think also there's a huge like moral philosophical component that we're just kind of eliding here for the purpose of discussing the causal relation kind of aspect of it. But, you know, like, it's worth mentioning that, you know, a big kind of part of this is theodicy, right? And so the Ash'aris are concerned to deal with, you know, many of the problems that had arisen from other kinds of schools of philosophy in the Islamic world that would constrain God, basically, to do only what is right or just or good or balanced or fair by some kind of human metric. And so the Ash'ari school is very much about citing the justification for what God does within his power and his absolute lack of need or, you know, objective with respect to the world. But that's kind of separate from what we might describe as this kind of like empty box for subsuming causal explanations.
Yeah. I mean, and when in the Ghazali that we read today too, when he mentions like, we know that not all knowledge benefits, or it doesn't always benefit everyone all the time. Like, you have to really understand specific situations and people and what they can and should deal with and what they shouldn't deal with, like what will hurt them. And I think that is really, at least of this kind of tradition of like Sunni scholarship, we could say, around these issues. You really can't, like, that's never separable in terms of, it's the paramount concern of this kind of literature, is this, like, you know, it's about people, really fundamentally, in a way that always struck me as like similar, I guess you could say, to Confucianism, pretty much of any stripe or period. Like, there is a similar emphasis on the fact that in concern here is like people's ethical education, behavior, and realization. And well, depending on like where you sit on that, you might believe that the ethical perfection of the human being carries with it a lot of like unseen, hidden, and like metaphysical aspects, levels of knowledge that are experiential and that are only vaguely describable, which you kind of see in a book like The Doctrine of the Mean, like one of the four Confucian classics. Definitely the one that has, you know, anything approaching like metaphysics in it in a direct way, but they posit kind of that like the sage has reached a level of attainment where he is so actualized that, given at least an implicit kind of like microcosm, macrocosm understanding of man and the 10,000 things, all of everything else, that he then, like, in some ways, like, having perfected himself thus, is now leading to the perfection of things around him, and like things are just naturally better in his presence because of his like his attainment, you could say. And I don't really have a lot to say about that with certainty, but like, you know, it reminds me a lot of the idea of like insan al-kamil, or like, you know, the real human being in certain bodies of Islamic thinking, like the person who is fully attaining the like possibilities inherent in the human condition that very few people ever really come to. And I mean, it's obviously very similar to descriptions of, you know, the saints and their activity and the like the moral change that happens to people around them and things like that. So it's an interesting point of convergence, I think, between these two traditions that are otherwise pretty geographically distant. But it also speaks to the fact that I think we're going to come back to time and again, which is that their concerns are, you could in some ways say, are largely pragmatic, even though they're not pragmatist.
Right.
But they are, like, the most important thing is like taking human beings and like making them better. And there's an obvious telos to that implied, and each, you know, everyone kind of has some idea of what that is, but it's really the point of all of this is that rather than completely like disinterested speculative metaphysics being like a good in and of itself, which I don't think people in either tradition would necessarily agree to that statement.
Yeah, and this goes back to, you know, are we wasting our time with causal explanations, right? Like, what are these for, right? And you know, how would we assess that? And I think it should be clear to everyone now that, like, you know, being a causal explanation user in modernity does not really imply any type of ethical orientation at all. And, you know, if you're just kind of being swept up in institutional currents, like, you're probably going to end up doing weird stuff. Like, you know, just to touch on a contemporary example, I mean, I genuinely believe that most of the scientists who were doing, you know, like gain of function research or whatever on coronavirus, did not intend to cause a global pandemic and kill, you know, millions of people or whatever it is. But at the same time, there was nothing telling them, you know, this is going to have bad outcomes, right? Like, even if this is, even if you're working with good explanations that allow you to predict and control outcomes, like these are things that you're doing because you're just like totally unmoored at this point. Like, your knowledge, if it ever did operate on, you as an ethical being is not doing that right now.
Right. And I think it's probably for anyone who is, just from my own experience, like having grown up in this society, being steeped in the way that we think about things as like, the hegemonic modes of thinking, forms of understanding, it's very difficult to understand a like integrated, somewhat like form of thinking about all these different things, like whether or not there's a kind of like monism of knowledge or not. There is a like integration of concerns with every branch of things. It's something that is often called in Islam like rooting knowledge. Like knowledge is rooted. Like you can take knowledge that Muslims didn't produce, but you root it, which I think primarily is like rooting it first in like an Islamic understanding of belief, which is, like the fundamental and primary science, and making sure that it's not like contradicting what you basically like know axiomatically to be true based on reason and revelation or whatever. But then like the greater project maybe of integrating it into like a social spiritual product of like realizing whatever set of like moral ethical things you like you have this sort of commitment to realize in this world. And like, does it serve those ends? Not, like, do you need it or is it worthless? Because why else would you have knowledge, And you might say like, well, what about things that just make our lives easier? And I think that understanding like fully encompasses something like that. There's not really like, you could say that like scientific achievements to like make food easier to grow or something, like those are necessarily bound up in that project of ethics. And I like, well, for instance, when you read Mencius, he is talking pretty often about farming. A lot of he spends a good amount of time on things like not over foresting or overfishing, and kind of getting into ideas of like having a sustainable supply of resources sort of like in perpetuity as much as one could attempt to make that possible, and a societal organization which enables people to like all have enough that they're not worried for their subsistence, because he would posit that only under those conditions is like ethical behavior and instruction possible for like the general mass of people, and that while like specifically, like a ethical elite or like the gentleman or the junsa or whatever is capable of maintaining his ethical posture even in extremely dire circumstances, it's not something you could really expect from the whole of the people. And history completely bears out the fact that when under strain and like existential threat, people will often do whatever they have to, and that's not always like good or conducive to civilization and like peace and trying to produce these things that are like things that at least if you are a Muslim or a Confucian or whatever, you would say are like the good or something to be attained in this world socially. And if you're a Muslim, then the good of the next world, which you hope and strive for in this world by doing like good acts.
Yeah, and indeed, we can say perhaps in the Confucian tradition as well. I mean, if Kongzi himself was a monotheist, as I think perhaps we're going to stake out that as a contention on this podcast. This is a Confucian monotheism podcast. Yeah, the good of the next world as well. Yeah, and. Yeah, so I guess that's probably enough about that, right? Like where are we here? We're still with Ibn Taymiyyah, right? So
yeah, I think we can like finish out the material I have of his, and we can quickly like go through a little bit of Ibn al-Qayyim, and then I think we'll be in a good place to talk about it. And if we want to, we can even visit like the implications of this for the social realm a little bit.
Yeah,
with some Alistair McIntyre and stuff I pulled from the feed of Brother Kantbot.
Okay, right on it.
So back to Ibn Taymiyyah here on astrology. The edifice of their science is based on the premise that the superior movements are the cause of events in this world, and that knowing the cause necessarily yields not what is caused. And what is caused, if you are interested, the Arabic is musabbab. But this only happens when one knows the complete cause, whose rule does not fail to be implemented. The most those know, however, is that they know only a tiny part of the sum of the many causes and do not know the rest of the causes, nor their conditions, nor the things hindering them. There is a marginal note in that piece there where we are given a bit from Ibn Sina, who wrote in one of his works where he engages in a refutation of astrology. Yet to wonder if man does or does not perceive that which is hidden, al-ghayb, belongs to the principles, and the Prophet, God bless him and grant him peace, denied such a perception. We have a pretty fundamental agreement with Ghazali, I think, on the fact that causes, insofar as they exist, can be, like, it seems that they're not denying that they have some kind of reality, but the contention, specifically with astrology and other forms of divination, is that these things do not apprehend causality in terms of its existence in a sufficient way to have any kind of knowledge about what should follow from something else. So really, like, it's an epistemic claim here that's being made against astrology. One interesting thing to note, since we were talking about whether or not Ibn Taymiyyah might be anti-Greek, there's a section of one of his fatwa where he says, "The philosophers all agree on the fact that no greater nomos reached the world than the nomos that Muhammad brought, God bless him and grant him peace." And in relation to the fact that the translation used nomos rather than like law, for instance, Yahya Mishat says, in this passage, Ibn Taymiyyah clearly uses the Arabic transliteration for the Greek nomos in the sense of Sharia. It is of interest to note that such a usage, far from being exclusive to philosophers, the Ikhwan al-Safa, Sena et al., it is also accepted by a religious scholar like the Shaykh al-Islam. Such an explicit assimilation of the Sharia to the Greek law offers a good illustration of the extent of the continuity between the classical Greek and Islamic Weltanschauungs, as analyzed by Leo Strauss. Just interesting to point out, like, I would imagine that most people probably, I have no idea that something like that was, found casually in some of his writings. And I think the extent to which... so here's, just to take a brief aside, this after I started reading about, like, Chinese Islam and other places where Islam took root but had a really different cultural expression, I came to like kind of reassess the way that I understood Islam, which I think we kind of granted a normative status to just like anything that happened in the Mediterranean world. You know, like,
Yeah.
that's Islam, and then things further away from that are like blank Islam. However, if you take the kind of view of it where Islam, you know, what is Islam? Well, it's like, it's the Tao of Muhammad, or, you know what I mean? It's the Sharia, it's this method by which you are walking like a path towards your salvation. So it contains things like revelation, rulings based explicitly or derived from revelation about how you should behave and do things in the world, rulings about what beliefs you should hold and why you should hold them, methodologies for walking this path towards, you know, kind of radically transforming yourself as a person and achieving your end. These are all like they're to some extent, some of them were like developed and explicated in a pretty specific cultural context or a series of them. But the way that I think traditionally it has been understood is like that what is essential, and we'll just use that word kind of like informally to that, you know, that can go and take root there, and it will be instantiated and like have an efflorescence in that new place in a way that's culturally very particular and specific to that place. Now, nothing about that will ever contravene what is certain or absolute, you know, in terms of like the rulings of the Sharia or, you know, the Aqidah, the beliefs, principles of the Deen. But it's still, you know, retaining everything essential may not look all that much like what happened in Syria, for instance, you know, or anywhere, or Al-Andalus. And so now I started, when I look back, I think so a lot of what we think of as like, oh, that's just like pure Islam is really like Hellenistic Islam. Like if we want to use terms like Chinese Islam or like, you know, Indian Islam, I think we could probably benefit from looking at really a lot of what took place after Islam left Arabia as Hellenistic Islam, because it was absolutely the flowering of Islam in a very Hellenistic cultural context with a lot of Hellenistic ways of thinking and doing things. And seeing that somehow like more intrinsically Islamic than what happens elsewhere, I think is perhaps a mistake. But with that marginalia out of the way, we'll return.
I think you're right on.
One interesting thing, so Al-Jawziya's Miftah Dar al-Sa'ada, my Arabic pronunciations are probably horrible, so you have to forgive me if you can actually speak Arabic, has been compared often, and I've seen this in more than one place, like in more than one journal article, to Pico de Mirandola's Adversus Astrologium. So apparently, and it's entirely possible, I would think, that like Pico de Mirandola like actually read some material from the Islamic world refuting astrology and or made use of it, because he, if I'm remembering correctly, studied with a Jewish scholar who certainly had knowledge of Arabic and classical Arabic literature. One of the many ways in which the Renaissance Italian thinkers were penetrated by Arabic knowledge, and it kind of filtered in different interesting ways.
Definitely.
So anyways, the couple articles I had about Al-Jawziya, Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziya, are more of a summary with a few direct quotes than an actual translation. So not all of this is him speaking himself, but anyways, Al-Jawziya particularly thinks that the influences upon human character are found in natural conditions of heat and climate. And he has this whole like funny thing about how it's like all great civilizations sprung up along really like a particular band of kind of just between the equator and like the pole, just at the right place where you could get China, Persia, etc. Like any place of great civilizational achievement ends up along this band. And if you go further south or further north, for instance, further north you get he numbers is like the Franks, the Turks, all these people who are just too white, they're too fat, they're too sluggish, like they're not capable of great thinking. It's unfortunate for them, but they have to be in this benighted state because of their climate. And
northern barbarians,
right?
Common.
And he's going to posit that when you want to talk about the effect of astral phenomena upon the world, then you really can only do it in this way, because to him this is just like pretty self-evidently observable, like climate, access to water, food, these kinds of things all interdependent on the sun's energy, the way, and like all this stuff, like that's the effect that you can talk about on personality, or you can at least reason about. And what all this seems to indicate is that the influences of the types of human character are attributable to the natural conditions prevailing in the 7 regions. Sun, wind, earth, the reflection of the rays are all partial causes, to the totality of which is the one cause, all-knowing, the powerful, from whom comes the order of the world, which these ignoramuses know not. With the general public, we're moving away from Jauziya back to the kind of summary, with the general public offering a market of buyers ready to pay for and believe almost anything that was well-dressed in logical structure and scientific jargon, and that offered the hope of gain or security in a tumultuous period, the occult prospered during these times. That was appended to like the earlier summary we read of the situation going on in the Islamic world at that time.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, it was like strikingly similar to something going on today.
Yeah.
Jauziya kind of posits that like astronomy was a real science, a great science, and it had many great expositors. However, he thinks that in his time it's not only fallen but like lost, that there no one is left who does real astronomy. Like everyone is engaged in some kind of trickery for money, or like survival or whatever, and it's kind of like betrayed the like real roots of it as a meaningful science. And here we have it. Even as superior an astronomer and scientist as Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, whose failing weakness was to write a book on the art, Tafhim al-Nujum, could be seduced, though he had the good sense to criticize other astrologers. Al-Biruni's case highlights the dangers of astrology, for even great minds could be ensnared, and for Ibn al-Qayyim, al-Biruni was one of the best. He praises him as a great scientist who produced innumerable valuable works in astronomy and mathematics, including Zij, the Qanun al-Mas'ud, named after the Ghaznavid ruler. It should be noted here that even brilliant scientists subscribe to some belief in astrology. It seems reasonable to believe that just as the cyclic patterns of the luminaries determined the years and seasons and shaped the character of nature, so too was human character to some degree abstractly influenced by those patterns. For all his reservations concerning a great scientist who could write a text on astrology, Ibn al-Qayyim laments the passing of the days when men like al-Biruni were holding the line between true science and false. Sometime during the 3 centuries between al-Biruni's death and his own time, as the Hanbali theologians saw it, science had given way to false. Astronomy in our days is dead, he complained, quite as ironically as al-Biruni did in his, when Islamic science was owing in great part to his own prodigious output at its apogee. He had claimed that no real science was being done anymore. The Greeks had done it all. What came after was inconsequential and continued to be so.
Yeah. Ouch.
Which the author doesn't agree with. I think he says that there was quite a lot of interesting things going on in the Islamic world scientifically then and after, but I think a lot of these people have a at least extremely relatable tendency towards pessimism.
Yeah. You kind of expect to see broad dismissals in these, and again, like they are polemic works primarily.
Yeah, I mean, this is like probably a random Joe asking, is astrology fine? And so you have to kind of deliver the message that's appropriate to the audience or whatever.
Yeah.
And we'll go on and move to kind of, I think, a nice encapsulating statement of sort of, because Al-Jawziyya, one of the things that he does is he kind of just cycles through methods of refuting without a really like much of a concern as to like what the underlying framework for that is. So for a while he'll speak kind of in the mode as if he is like an adherent of some kind of Aristotelian physics and be like, even in this framework, it makes no sense. Aristotle himself, you know, contravenes what the astrologers say on many points. And then he'll move on and then like throw that into the garbage and then like talk about it in these other ways. And he kind of is like he's, you know, moving from like position to position, opening fire, and then moving to like a more advantageous position, opening fire. And like as he, you know, attempts to like mount this assault. So he's not really, when reading him, I think I learned to be a bit careful of like, because what we were saying with Causality or like Ibn Taymiyyah, like it doesn't seem like they refute some reality of like the apprehension of causes and reasoning about them. But it seems like with Ibn al-Qayyim, one would not want to take the fact that he's using a framework or his polemic as some kind of implicit justification, or like you wouldn't want to take it as if he believed in that per se, merely that he wanted to demonstrate that under a few different lenses it doesn't hold up. I think you might say under no lens does it really hold up. And he says one cannot proceed logically or from the mathematical and rational to the divine sciences. The first concerns secondary intelligible objects, knowledge of which derives from thought and experience, and the second is learned directly from God's angels.
So we might gloss that perhaps in a secular framework as the difference between reason and intuition.
Right. One you have like experience and like rationality, and then the other you have some kind of direct knowing, which is different and much discussed, I think, in the early modern period in various ways. So he kind of wants to set up that like the rational, we'll say like the physical sciences or whatever, the mathematical and rational sciences, you'll learn things like medicine or astronomy or whatever. You'll build like models, you'll try to do intervention, like whatever you're going to be doing with them, and that can help you attain those ends. But that only with the divine sciences can you attain to knowledge of good and evil, right and wrong, the path to which you should walk, and like what we were saying earlier, like the ends of all human life as understood in the Islamic tradition. It's really only possible for you to get that information in a really reliable way that you can act upon by having access to revelation, essentially, where it was revealed to people by God's angels, and that is not knowledge that one can attain to. Like he pretty directly, I think, says that there's no rational morality. What he will admit, and it's kind of an interesting point of maybe tension, is that, you know, he obviously is not going to deny the concept of the fitra, or like in the Islamic tradition, which is like this understanding of a primordial human disposition, if you will, which on some level does attain to access to knowledge of what is right and wrong, but which, and I think, well, we could just stop here and say this is really incredibly similar to one of the central focal points of Monks' understanding of the Confucian school, which is that man is essentially born with the sprouts of virtue, he calls them. You've got all of these capacities towards really the primary Confucian virtues of like wisdom, righteousness, and compassion, empathy with other people. And one of the most famous sort of argument he gives as proof of this is that, you know, you can imagine anyone, if they saw a child falling into a well they would have a split-second urge to save the child. And the difference between people then would not be in their initial capacities or their initial disposition, but the lives that they had led or their physical circumstances after and beyond that, which are perfectly capable of clouding and destroying man's original ethical nature. Thus, the man won't always save the child. He may begin calculating immediately what sort of worldly gain might come from saving that child. But it would all, Mengzi would say, come after the initial brief spark that says, like, you have to save that person from dying. And it's natural, it's reflexive, it's like probably pre-rational in some way, at least in his understanding. And he likens this kind of capacity to, like, people say, because he was arguing against people who would say, like, human nature is neutral, or human nature maybe even is evil. And he would say, they would be like, well, look, there's obviously people who have no trace of goodness, so what do you say about them? And he would say, you know, there are mountains that used to have forests on them, but after all the trees were cut down, there was no sign of the forest. But could you say that there was never a forest there? And there's a lot of other metaphors that he goes on to deploy, which are all basically the same, like, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence.
I think that's a very interesting parallel with the concept of fitra as well. Like, it seems to map very closely.
Yeah, it's because it's not necessarily that, like, all human beings have rational access to morality, because you have a lot of intervening circumstances which are going to dampen that to some extent or another. And I think it at least is, like, kind of an explanatory framework for understanding, like, human difference in this area. It is at least internally pretty consistent, because you do have people who, you know, maybe they're not extremely religious, but seemingly they would gain the acclaim of, like, anyone that they met, you know, that they were, like, a good person, and some understanding of that, which in our times it would be difficult to give a, like, direct explanation of what does being good even mean. Yeah, we would all have a kind of feeling about them of, like, I trust them, they're helpful, you know, they seem to care about people, they have opportunities to seek their own gain at others' expense, and they never take them, you know. Maybe this person's not religious in any way, but they still embody things. And there is this kind of explanation within both, like, each of these frameworks to kind of say, like, ethical education is one way, and it's the way most people have to follow in order to achieve something like that, but it's not necessarily the only way. And some people are born, Jushi, the later formulator of what would be called the School of the Way, which we refer to with the exonym of Neo-Confucianism. He would say that, like, people are endowed with different like mixtures of chi or something to that extent. So your psychophysical makeup could really differ person to person in a lot of ways. And some people might be born with a chi such that it's just very easy for them to enact virtue. And you might even say that someone like, you know, the initial sage kings of China might fall under that, where for it's really no effort, they're just doing it. It's almost like they're being kind of divinely helped, you could say. And I mean, that's certainly, like, we have we talk about the prophet, the holy prophet, in the sense that he was, you know, free from sin. Not to say that, you know, he wasn't human, but he was kind of, like, divinely protected from certain actions. So there's, like, a pretty, I would say, like, interesting and subtle understanding of, like, how the human experience relates to, like, goodness. And I think both of these traditions at least have a strong, like, current running through them, where there's an emphasis on the fact that human beings do have a moral predisposition, but it can be effectively blotted out via your choice or your circumstances. And so Ibn Qayyim, while he says, like, you need revelation, he kind of also admits that fitra is real, and it has a part to play, and all of these things kind of, they interact in, like, maybe a dynamic and interesting way, and, like, kind of in accord with the theme of this episode. It's, like, not always entirely available to us what that is. The article goes on to say, to, like, kind of summarize his thought, that science and philosophy have no moral content. Spiritually, they're empty shells. The rational intellect has no power of moral judgment, of distinguishing between morally rewarding acts and those that are punishable. The intellect, however, does have an innate intelligence called fitra, whose providence can be said to be moral in that it is able to distinguish between good and evil. For the physician-philosopher al-Razi, not Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi, I think, but the other one, the earlier one.
Right.
Some 4 centuries before Ibn al-Qayyim, this fitra, a power of the rational mind, was what endowed man with the power of prophecy, a potential actualized only by a rare few. For Ibn al-Qayyim, all animals have fitra. Man, at the head of the animal kingdom, has primary fitra, which God gives prophets to deliver his laws. However, once the prophets enunciate the divine laws, man does not immediately recognize the wisdom in them, as though they had been hovering in the shadows of fitra somewhere on the edge of the mind, waiting for the gentle tug of light or flutter of the prophetic wings. Quite the opposite. And here's a direct quote. An Arab being asked how it was he knew Muhammad was a prophet, replied that when something was prescribed by the prophet or Quran, mind said, "Oh, how I wish it were proscribed." This is to say that the intellect's inclinations are contradictory to revelation. Ibn al-Qayyim leaves the reader hanging as to whether primary fitra is an innate faculty that is as well applicable to natural principles as it is to moral law.
That's funny. I like that little anecdote at the end there.
That is really funny.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to say that I can relate to that as a human being.
Yeah, it's just there is that kind of element as well. Yeah.
So I mean, I feel like this all here. Okay, I'll read one more part, and then we can wrap this section up. According to Ibn al-Qayyim, true Islam neither accepts a fixed and ordered universe operating in predictable cycles through a causal network of effectual relationships from God to grass, nor absolutely rejects it. Conversely, Islam neither rejects nor accepts absolutely al-Ash'ari's determinist game of cosmic chance, whereby the universe as we know it is temporally discontinuous, atomistic, being repeatedly extinguished and divinely recreated in a series of serial flashes beyond human perception, so that God is the direct cause of all events and things, rather than events and things being causes of one another. And he goes on to kind of hold to what I would say is like the pretty standard Islamic account of free will, which is billa kayfa. You know, it is what it is, that God has all power, everything is predetermined, but at the same time you can make choices, and rationally that might seem quite strange or difficult, but it is essentially, I think, it's something that you find pretty much as like the hegemonic viewpoint in Islam, at least Sunni Islam, and I would say it's typically also understood and is understood in this article as being kind of like illustrative of the Islamic tendency towards the mean, that you have on one side the determinists and on the other side the holders for absolute free will, and then you have the path of like the broad way of Sunni Islam somewhere in the middle. And it's not something that you can easily put into like a discursive explanation, but nonetheless the reality of it is assented to as being the way that it is and the way that you're supposed to interact with things. And it reminds me, Sheikh Faraz Rabbani once said, I believe, that causes and conditions and effects are like, you deal with those because that is the adab that you are supposed to have with God's creation. Like, God has made creation this way, so whether or not you want to think about it as an Ash'ari or like as a more of a like Aristotelian-ish rationalist, or as something else that's within the boundaries of accepted theological difference of opinion, we are all kind of like practically dealing with life in pretty much the same way, and whether or not we believe, you know, like that our choices are real or whatever, we're still undergoing the like phenomenological experience of life and of seemingly making choices. And, you know, if you want to know the depth to which that can go, I mean, you merely only need to look at the voluminous literatures of like Sufi help literature, or like we've been talking about any of like the Confucian stuff, anything that deals with like the actual conditions of human life and the ways in which kind of like master themselves and understands themselves better, like spiritual psychology, if you will. And that I think the kind of idea is that like that's the more important thing for you to be thinking about. And it really falls in line with the theme that we've been seeing here so much, which is that like the ultimate reality, at least for you, for me, it's not available to you right now. And the other things are that have kind of greater importance for me in my life and my ultimate end as a human being. So I thought his position, though, was pretty interesting, that, it was at least implicit that by denying neither school of thought, both were kind of like, at least insofar as they don't contradict anything that's held to be certain, like permissible.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, one thing that really struck me in Sherman Jackson's book, Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering, is the one which does the bait and switch, which has an introduction about the problem, the theological problem presented by intergenerational slavery in the U.S., and then goes on to be like a thorough kind of exposition of how you would solve theodicy, any theodicy, right? Not just this racial issue, in each one of the traditional schools of Islamic theology or philosophy. And his section on Ibn Taymiyyah is really fascinating. And one of the things that he points out is that Ibn Taymiyyah actually advances this position about like existence having intermeshing properties that allow them to have causal efficacy, that are like grants of causal efficacy that are given to existence and specify the way in which they are able to interact with other existence, right? So there's a lot of directions that could have been taken, and it's interesting to see that like Ibn Taymiyyah and his student Imam al-Jawziyya are both kind of arguing for like not at all an abandonment of causal reasoning, nor this kind of like de-rationalization of philosophy or natural science, but rather sort of like a tempered and measured approach that actually is moving toward a more developed kind of causal position than was present in the Ash'ari school, but nonetheless is pessimistic, right? Understands that by definition any such explanation that you would offer as a particular human under particular circumstances is going to be flawed, right? And you're not going to attain to whatever the truth is about the that particular instance or whatever data set you happen to have.
Right. I think another place where it's interesting to me to see kind of how understandings are sort of divergent. Like the idea of essences or whatever has like a particular Western pedigree that you could say would be like Plato had a position on essence, Aristotle had another position on essence, and so on. The idea undergoes a lot of shifts, reformulations, and whatever. And I don't think that I would say there's an exact parallel in, say, like the School of the Way or like the Jushi school of Confucianism, what ended up kind of being inspired primarily by him and his teachers. But nonetheless, there is a kind of what we saw in Shen Kuo, which was that there are things which they have reality, and they have a reality that could be said to be greater than the reality of like physical things that we see, because physical things are made up of the admixture of both of them, the Li and the Qi. That it's clear to me when we're talking about that, we're not talking about mental abstraction as such, because those really, like, whether or not you think about them, it doesn't really matter. Like, you could kind of go through your whole life, and I'm sure that like 99.99% of Chinese peasants who ever lived went through their lives not thinking that much about the Li and the Qi. So there is a sense in which like these things are not reliant on being like rational abstractions that are subsuming particulars underneath universals, like this very kind of Aristotelian, Kantian sort of thing. This is something else entirely. You could just say it's just like Eastern metaphysics. It's kind of undertaken a different way. It talks about a different order of reality. And I think that when we talk about, like, is there an idea of essence in Islam, one that's maybe distinct from the Falasifa kind of doing an Aristotelian thing? And I think that you could say, like, yeah, you could analogically say that there's something that it's like an analogy maybe for essence as we understand it in like Occidental philosophy, but perhaps similarly to what's going on in China, when you're talking about things at that level, we're not saying that like the essence of man is thinking animal. You know what I mean? We're saying that like there are fundamental levels of existence that are beyond like the apparent, and perhaps some access to them is available to like the saints or sages or whatever. Some of that comes down to us, but by and large it's not extremely important for those of us who are like myself pretty undeveloped and sad, miserable things to dwell on. And I think this is kind of the explanation for the fact that there's these large bodies of knowledge and things that are made for like regular people like me, and that there are other levels of knowledge which might be more rarefied or more elite discourses, which typically you're not encouraged to take part in if you're not at that level, because you wouldn't be able to attain to understanding of it. And whatever its purposes are for, like, I can't apprehend that yet because I'm at like a different stage. And I think that you find it in Islam, certainly. I would also say you find it in like Chinese stuff as well, that there's like particularities to the level of human development which kind of prescribe what they should know and what they should be doing with that knowledge. So I think this kind of, not entirely, but it's kind of in distinction to, it's definitely to the modern Western idea of like what knowledge is, where everyone has a brain. If it's explained to you enough, you'll understand it because you have a brain. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, for sure.
Whereas it really just, our understanding of knowledge is that there's no like phenomenological ethical component to it whatsoever, no experiential, at least not in this way. It's like we were saying with Shen Kuo, like he was saying something that's really relevant and really meaningful to a lot of problems, like epistemic and otherwise today. But how many people from like the Western kind of, from a Western mode of thought, could read him and like immediately grasp what he was trying to, without kind of having immediate recourse to like this fuzzy Chinese mystical stuff, like that kind of understanding, which would completely bar you from actually grasping the meaning of what was going on there. There's just sort of an inability to deal with like the aphoristic, or people who understood that language does not map one-to-one onto reality and thus used it appropriately.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, maybe just to bring this back to Rescher's book, Cognitive Harmony, that his like major kind of thrust in that book is that the decisions that you make about ontology or epistemology in what seem to be like restricted local areas have consequences for your entire worldview or outlook, as well as your ethics, right? So it's definitely not true that you can learn, let's say, about the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics and accept that as being a body of knowledge that describes actual existence and like actual processes in the world. This is what's going on, right? Like wave function collapse is what determines on some level or another the outcome of events. That has deep implications for the ethical content of your life and the cultural and political and economic contents of your life, right? Like, you know, if you look at our society, it's deeply structured by this idea that, like, you know, things just kind of randomly happen, and, you know, the luck of the draw is the way things actually are, you know, and that this is not a way of expressing uncertainty, nor, you know, like actually encoding how much knowledge we have about something, but rather describes the way things actually are. And, you know, I mean, it's the most common kind of like glib atheist, you know, 20-year-old depressoid, not to criticize, you know, been there, done this, right? Like, kind of position that you're going to take is like, okay, well, I don't need to deal with metaphysics, and I don't need to deal with any of this because things just happen randomly, right? Like, I don't require deep explanations that would actually compel me to seek cognitive harmony, right? To seek unity across these different kinds of fields in a way that's going to, like, not only be successful, you know, in this world, in the next world, whatever it is, but to have an operational effect on your soul, on your psyche, right? And it's going to do something to you, you know, like it really is. And like, I mean, we talk fairly routinely about, you know, like mathematical education and stuff like this, because both of us have been very frustrated with it at different times. And like this absolutely is symptomatic, right? Where it's just kind of like, it doesn't really matter how you learn math. Like, you're just going to learn this kind of like this sequence of topics that have been more or less carefully selected in order to produce aerospace engineers.
Yeah.
Right. Like, you know, the point is to make more Lockheed Martin engineers. Like, it's not to you know, have an effect on people in general that is salutary for their you know, overall flourishing, right? That's not the point. So, you know, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think this has probably been one of the most helpful kinds of aspects of you know, both the Islamic and you know, classical Chinese traditions for the both of us, is kind of opening our eyes a little bit to, like, okay, if you don't have a broader perspective in terms of how this all fits in and what you're not saying, right, what's hidden, what's unmeasurable, you know, all of these kinds of things, what could be unmeasurable, and, you know, obviously you don't know exactly what's there. If you don't do those things, then that has an effect on, like, your well-being. Like, it can make you sick. I know you, like, I've been sick because of my defective causal reasoning about the world, right? Like, oh yeah, it's all about, like, reproduction, and, like, this is all just kind of this meaningless series of events that, like, you know, basically is driven by a series of, like, maximization functions which intend to ultimately, you know, just cause my genetic material to proliferate at the expense of other people's, or, you know, whatever it is, right? Like, this kind of, you know, this is one of the things that Adam Curtis gets at with, like, game theory and with, like, particular views about ecology, about what life is about. Like, these have, like, really severe consequences, particularly when, like, you know, people who are not in a position to critique the contents of these theories, right? It's the science. It's capital T, capital S, the science. You know, and these days you can't dissent, right? Like, or you're canceled. You're done. So, I mean, at least in certain social milieus. But, you know, that kind of attitude means that people they don't even get a choice over, like, the operations that are being done on their psyche by these, like, ostensibly neutral kinds of models that they're assimilating as, like, the way things are, and not, you know, epistemic constructs. These are not artifacts, or they're not being presented as, like, artifacts of human thought, right? Like, it involves mathematics. Well, it involves discretization. It's not a direct mapping onto a continuous reality. I guess the Ash'aris would say, well, reality is not continuous, so that's your problem. But yeah, you know, but I mean, I think we can definitely say that for the both of us, I mean, this is an extremely important point, right? Like, that your commitments with regard to even your supposedly neutral scientific ontology are going to have direct effects on what kind of a society you live in, what kind of a family you have, what kinds of decisions you're making, and what kinds of goods you're actually able to obtain with, like, it doesn't matter how good your models are. If what your models are doing to you is making you sick, then you're simply not going to be able to predict and control phenomena in a way that produces benefits for others.
Right. And I think that it also can feed the other way. One of Dr. Sherman Jackson's, I think, great points was about the structures of plausibility idea, that when the things, like in your social world, or like even, social and other kind of related things, when those sort of reinforce a Weltanschauung, I guess you can say, it becomes that much easier to like embody it. And this is like really, I think, one of the major concern ideas these days and prior is, what's the function of society? It's to make the good life possible, or whatever. It's to make virtue possible. If you're like a Christian or whatever, then it's like to make attaining salvation possible, like, or at least more probable. And there is, at least in that worldview, I think, a deep understanding of the fact that, like, if society is constituted around certain values, then they become self-evident in the things in that society. Or it's like Heidegger saying that, like, art is what a society valued the most. You find it in the art and the way that the art is. And those things, like, as much as your mental framework kind of is how you're going to deal with the world on every level, so too does the world kind of send back into you its contents, and you mirror it as well in a kind of dual motion sort of thing. And I think that because we often say, like, well, I'm like, when I was just, as we've said, like a callow atheist, it always seemed like, I want to believe, but it's just so hard because of the cold of rationality has dispelled from our lives this, like, comforting illusions of faith. And I think that that's how people really thought about it. But the freedom from that came to realizing how, like, contextual that is, like how socially specific that is, how socially informed that is. And, like, you start to ask, like, well, would I feel this way if I didn't live in a society, like, dominated by greed and pornography? Like, maybe not.
Yeah. And if I travel back in time and murdered H.P. Lovecraft, like, would that be as available to everyone? If he hadn't written what he'd written, and I like those stories and everything, but it's I think an example of these plausibility frameworks that you're talking about, right? You have these matrices of sort of aesthetic as well as intellectual experiences that come together and enable or preclude states of being, right? Not just behaviors, but like states that you're going to internalize and that build on one another in a progression towards a telos, right? Like we have a society that's, like, almost built to stunt that from happening, right? Like you will have a stunted psyche if you just kind of were to mainline dark minimalist kind of atheism that nonetheless kind of always fails to be able to remove the self from the picture, right? Like you're still like in your death you're imagining the world without you by, like, flying around in a disembodied camera, like after you've been killed in a video game, right? Like you're just looking at everything, like,
it's maybe we can briefly touch on a little bit of something from Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. It might just open this up a little bit more, because we've spent a lot of time on, like, natural science and mathematics as it relates to, like, ethics, we'll say.
Right.
But they're, like, a big part of, we'll say, the modern project has been the direct application of principles from physics and engineering applied directly to the social world. I've got a few, like, excerpts from After Virtue's chapter about this particular thing, social science. McIntyre writes, as the functions of modern states become more and more the same, their civil services likewise. While political masters come and go, civil servants maintain the administrative continuity of government and thus confer on government much of its character. The major justification for government intervention in society is the contention that the government has resources of competence which most citizens do not possess. That competence is essentially like the government is staffed by people trained sociologically in some way. They've got a varying expertise in like bureaucratic management and like some form of sociological understanding of society. So he goes on, he like says, you know, here I've got 4 like greatly lauded social scientific generalizations. Let's talk about some things about them. And one is that they lack universal quantifiers and scope modifiers, meaning they are not genuinely of the form for all x and some y. If x has property A, then y has property B. We also cannot say under which conditions they hold. We also have no way to apply them systematically beyond the limits of observation to unobserved or hypothetical instances, which is like Baconian science, induction. You cannot take some kind of set of generalizations of the social world, and when you we'll say when you apply them, you have equally as much success as the astrologers, and that maybe ought to tell you something about the social scientific enterprise. So then there's a counterclaim. Well, these aren't that. These are probabilistic generalizations. But McIntyre says the claim that they are probabilistic generalizations misses the point. Probabilistic generalizations in natural science possess universal quantifiers. Quantification is over sets, not over individuals. They entail well-defined sets of counterfactual conditionals, and they are refuted by counterexamples in the same way as other law-like generalizations. I think he says that pretty much any social scientific generalization, like every single one, more than likely has some kind of established counterexample. And even some of the most famous and heavily cited of these generalizations are like the bedrock of much later sociological work. Despite having numerous attendant counterexamples, that has not really shaken their importance whatsoever in the field. And like, how are we to understand this enterprise? And he goes through some stuff about like Machiavelli and fortune and whatever, and if you're interested in that, you can listen to the podcast Exhaust, where I talk about that in a little bit more detail with our friend Emmett. But for the purposes of this podcast, he moves into game theory, and he basically says, like, here's the thing, game theory, games, examples in books about game theory, like those always contain a determinate set of players and like a determinate area of play, like some mixture of those things. And so you have like pieces and terrain to reason about in a way that is, the complexity is not like greater than your mind's capability of encompassing to some extent. Whereas in real life, obviously at the outset, there is no determinate, innumerable set of factors, the totality of which comprise the situation. To suppose otherwise is to confuse a retrospective standpoint with a prospective one. And he has a great example of like when people play Gettysburg war games, it's like very easy for the Confederates to win because the Confederate player knows that he's fighting Gettysburg. He knows like troop dispositions, the coming of reinforcements, like all these things are known to him. He has a retrospective view of the Battle of Gettysburg, and thus he can make the right decisions.
Right.
However, the idea is that probably like Robert E. Lee would be a better general than that guy in any real life context, so why did Robert E. Lee fail? And the answer is that Robert E. Lee was not fighting the Battle of Gettysburg. He was just in like a real life situation.
Yeah, right. Right.
Which all of this essentially points to, there's kind of an underlying reality conflation, which I think has kind of been the subtext of our entire talk. which is that we develop mental models. They might be better or worse, particularly if we're trying to talk about the political and social worlds. Our mental models are always going to be beset by the fact that they can never incorporate the totality of causes and conditions, which would allow us to have certainty of prediction, which, amazingly is something we just heard from like 3 different medieval Islamic thinkers. Which I felt like, so this is kind of where it all came together for me, and I was kind of surprised that all of the fatwa on astrology just so happened to be like extremely relevant to talking about like social scientific modeling, and in a way, to the extent that social scientific modeling wants to like arrogate to itself predictive power and like social authority on that basis. I would say that like every single criticism epistemically of astrology is as applicable to this more in certain ways.
Yeah, I think in particular, this idea that, okay, it's not even that these explanations are not addressing causes that have effects on the system that you're interested in. It's that your model is so underspecified that if it's right, it's by accident, right? Like it's just not like the actual system is way too complicated. I mean, I honestly don't know how I feel about that today. I remember reading After Virtue, and that just like not striking me as like having any problems with it. What I would say about it is that even if you are kind of, let's say, more optimistic about the ability of, advanced statistics to produce good explanations or models of human, like political, economic systems, whatever it is, all of the models that are in use have not really been tested against alternatives in a way that would enable you to measure the evidence from a Bayesian perspective. You would want to know what the model evidence is for these models, given what we're talking about, right? Like, so he's talking about counterexamples. I mean, like, I think we'll come back to this. I think this is going to lead into at least a couple episodes. But I think what Feyerabend, the philosopher of science, Feyerabend would say about this is that it's not remarkable that these explanations have counterexamples in the data, right? Like all scientific explanations ignore things that are inconvenient for the explanation, and you have to, or otherwise, like you're just going to have explanatory chaos. There are just way too many different data sets that were generated under different presumptions, and so on and so forth. But I mean, like, from a Bayesian perspective, you can still take data that gives what seems to be a counterexample to a model and assess the likelihood, and therefore the model evidence, which is the marginal probability of the model over all possible parameterizations given that data set. Like, you can still calculate this stuff, right? So I mean, like, even if you take that perspective that, like, no, it's not that, like, basically Peter Thiel is an astrologist, right? Like, what Peter Thiel is doing is astrology. We could say that's a claim that we might make, on the basis of like what we've covered here, right? Like, the big data approach to governing society is not different than this. And I mean, even if you're more optimistic about this, I very much doubt that Peter Thiel is very concerned with assessing the quality of his explanations against, like, simpler alternatives or just completely different alternatives. Like, in other words, he has not tested a whole series of nested models in order to produce, the model that is most in accord with Occam's razor for, like, finding terrorists or whatever, nor has he, compared different, like, models of the generation of social violence in some rigorous ways, because that's not what he's doing, right? He's selling a product. So what matters is that, like, it meets the model output meets the expectations of the customer, which is, the U.S. military, U.S. intelligence services, whatever. you can still be optimistic and just say that, like, okay, nonetheless, people who are doing this are operating as astrologists because they're not taking the level of rigor that I think, if we want to bring it back to this idea of astronomy versus astrology, I mean, the astronomical statistics are now quite advanced, and the types of model comparison that are happening in astronomy, I think, are more sophisticated and more interesting than in any other field right now. So that is absolutely not the level that we're meeting in the social science, which is not to say that it can't be met, right? Like, you can still be kind of a statistical optimist and see the point here.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you that I think that if there is a method by which you can judge your modeling, then that provides some hope for the application of these quantitative methods to, like, social data of some kind, to attempt to, like, discover something that would then enable you, like, as a statesman, or something like that, to, like, make a judgment and then make a decision, which ultimately becomes some kind of, like, governmental action. I think that kind of setup is not like the baby and get thrown out with that bathwater, because that's really not what McIntyre is talking about, and it's certainly not what's being objected to, I think, by the medieval theologians. Because it obtains to some rigor and is, like, in some sense you could say, I don't know about falsifiable, but, like, there's a way of knowing that you might have, like, better or information, you could say. Like, there's a method by which that knowledge could be obtained, and thus you could at least take some stock of what you're dealing with, rather than just kind of, like, using something that just could be completely awful for whatever you're trying to optimize for, and, like, you have a way to know, which is something. And I think that, like, teasing out the differences here, which are often so subtle, is probably, like, kind of what's important, at least at this stage. Like, what are we talking about, and what are we doing, and what's the difference between those things? I mean, the truth is that, like, probably hardly anybody who has any societal importance knows much about, like, Bayes. Or, like, you know what I mean? Like, that, I don't think that stuff has, like, taken hold quite yet in the echelons of, like, authority and power or anything, of money. At least not that I've heard of.
Yeah, part of the reason for that, I mean, again, to take up a Feyerabенdian view here, the activity of science and of, philosophy and of art and of magic and all of these kinds of things, these sorts of activities are social activities which inevitably revolve around claims to orthodoxy. Right, because you can think of this in a very kind of, like, crass materialist way if you want. Like, there's a limited amount of, like, social resource to kind of supply all of these contending ideologies with, adherence and cultural energy and so on and so forth. And so there inevitably is this kind of contest. But I mean, I think it's just implied by the fact that, like, humans can conceive of things that are metaphysically contradictory, right? Like, you're always going to be bumping into people who are making claims that contradict your particular view of how things are. So, if we take this view where this is primarily to be understood as a social process characterized by claims to orthodoxy, Feyerabend would say, well, even if you have, even if you're a Bayesian, and you're offering, like, a more rigorous rule, this still doesn't guarantee that, like, science is progressive. It doesn't guarantee that what you're doing meets the sort of, like, Popperian or even Baconian view of, like, the progressive nature of science. But even if we accept that, what the Bayesian view does force you to do is state what you think you already know, and then to offer an estimate of your uncertainty on both the evidence that you're calculating for your model, as well as, like, whatever parameters you think obtain given your data. And I think the reality is that, like, if you do that habitually, you'll realize that, like, most data sets don't tell you very much. right? That, like, in other words, there are, if you, for some model, there are many parameterizations that make the data look somewhat likely given that model, right? So you have very wide uncertainties on, you know, what you think the parameters of some system might be, particularly like social systems or whatever, right? So this is not congenial at all for making claims to orthodoxy, right? Like if basically the system is set up to acknowledge this problem, right? That, you know, in many cases you're not going to be learning very much from any particular set of data, and you have wide uncertainty on many of your estimates, and, you know, like in many cases when you compare models, which, like, you know, many statistical practitioners just don't do, right? Like they just they have a model, and they optimize it against some data set, and they say, like, here's the model, here are the parameters of reality, right? But if you compare your models, what you find out is that, like, you have a whole bunch of shitty models, right? Mm-hmm. Like many of them can explain aspects of the data, but, like, none of them are comprehensive, and it comes down to, like, what your local kinds of needs are in terms of what's actually going to get used. And so, you know, yeah, I think this is a real problem, but I think what we can safely say is, like, something that did that took a stock of its own epistemic limits and kept the focus on the reality that we're always talking about epistemological constructs, is at least a less dangerous approach to this kind of causal reasoning from a moral standpoint, right? Like the imams of old would be more comfortable with a Bayesian approach than with, you know, someone finding the maximum likelihood estimate for a model and saying this is the way it is.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I think that's sort of been at the heart of, maybe you would say, like, the big conceptual difference between this approach and what we call, like, a pretty standard approach, but also a prevailing common understanding, which is, yeah, like, I know this model isn't, like, totally reality, but, like, it basically is maybe how often they're approached when they're set up, and then when they're disseminated to the public, even worse. This is the science, you know, so at least the scientist was like, well, you know, I know this isn't one-for-one reality, maybe they think that, but as soon as it gets into the news, it's completely lost, and we are left kind of, like, assimilating, you know, really, like, the waste matter of scientific discourse in a way, like things that if you entered, say, like the physics department or something, things that might have been cast away, you know, sort of recently as, like, ideas that no longer hold are going to remain in the public consciousness for much, much longer, even though it turns out that they were always kind of, like, phantasmic in terms of their reality. And so it's like we're just gobbling up this waste that they produce that we have no way of, like, intellectually dealing with except to kind of buy into it wholesale as somehow, like, a true scientifically justified explanation of things, which we then, like, triangulate off of, if not in making our decisions, then at least in justifying them after the fact. And then it turns out that none of that was ever real or meant anything, but then we get a whole new set of things, which is, like, surprise, going to be just the same thing. And this social process kind of, like, goes on ad infinitum, seemingly, without any end in sight. And I think that it's probably pretty correct to, like, lay a lot of the blame for that at the kind of, like, epistemic arrogance of a lot of statistics as it is practiced these days, and the lack of any kind of rigorous method of attaining to, like, the humility, which, you know, like, all people doing statistics should cry out with Shen Kuo that these are merely crude traces. When you look at your data, you say, this is a crude trace.
That's right. Get him, Shen Kuo. Maybe we'll kind of wrap up there. I think we kind of laid out some of the bits and pieces I think that we want to come back to in different ways here, and really, you know, I think it is important to get at this social process, because you have no choice, right? Like, if you want to be able, I mean, even just personally, like, you know, okay, I have some experiments I'm doing in my basement, right? Like, if you want those, little kinds of contributions that you're making to have an effect, you really have to take this seriously, right? Because it's in order to make a claim to orthodoxy, right, which is ultimately what we need to do here to kind of unseat, not us personally, but like someone
someone out there.
so someone out there is going to be doing this at some point, right? Is going to be overturning this social commitment that we have in one way or another, and they're going to need to incorporate like a quantitative element to this argument, right? Like, nobody cares about anything that doesn't make some reference to measurement, and maybe good reasons for that. Like, we can talk about the extent to which measurement is kind of like a foundational aspect of civilization governance to begin with. But yeah, like I think it's just, I don't know. I mean, for me anyways, I would just end with kind of like just a reminder that like the origin of the term statistics is from state, right? Like, these are, again, we're not even really concerned maybe necessarily with like the beliefs of individual scientists or individual people, although that does have like cultural effects. But ultimately, like, the decisions that are being made now are being made, that affect us all, are being made by very few people. They're being made on the basis of quantitative models, and those models have not been compared to alternatives in general, right? So this is a big problem that we're all going to be dealing with, particularly in the COVID context, for years and years and years and years. And if we don't wrap our heads around this, like, there's just no telling how scary this really could become.
Yeah, we'll have to sadly cry out that true science has died if something doesn't really change in that sphere, because I think you could say, like, well, at least like the emir or whatever, he didn't have that much power,
right?
Like, he collected taxes and fought sometimes and then enjoyed his pleasures in the palace or whatever and that kind of thing, but like, he stayed out of your life for the most part. But like, in terms of the modern nation state and its capabilities, institutions, and like the penetration which it has, is quite a bit different than that. And if we consider that they're being advised by people who might be likened to astrologers, that should be a little concerning, I think. And I think maybe even that framing, you could really cause some concern and consternation even among the most hardened kind of atheist rationalists, because they don't particularly care for astrology either.
yeah, and I probably in the spirit of scientific ecumenicalism, I mean, I think everyone recognizes that, like, you don't necessarily want to give an explanation with an explicitly theological background. Like, it's kind of like being an Ash'ari kind of implies being rude if you're a scientist, right? Because like, anytime someone asks you how does something happen, what's going on, it's just like, well, God's doing it. Just shut up, right? Like, so hopefully any kind of improvement that might be offered would be acceptable, irrespective of your metaphysical commitments.
Yeah, which at least we can admit that they exist.
Yeah,
they
right,
might have
right.
some meaning, but that can be discussed at its appropriate level and in its appropriate sphere in this kind of like ideal future we might imagine, where knowledge like somehow takes on a better form societally than it has hitherto. I mean, we didn't really get a chance to go into it, and it's like marginally applicable, but it's kind of like Kantbot's soapbox for the past while has been like similar stuff in terms of reality model conflation, but I think he really hones the aspects of the fact that we like have really reified ideas of like society and the world economy as less like real object, that has some kind of like independent reality, or like the abstraction of like individual like things that creates that up somehow, like they're the same thing and it's real or whatever. And how this is, I would say, to the right, I don't I can't say for sure. I haven't thought enough about it or whatever, or like read enough of what he has looked at. But to the extent that he's right, it's likely because of what we're talking about, or like that they're like very intimately related, like these processes of social reasoning, having kind of continually grown in the context of like the total state, if you will, which seeks kind of like, we could say, a completely hubristic level of control and like command of things, and that whatever ends that might have been originally like meant to point toward, like now it is kind of just in service of like global wealth transfers, like to the people who have kind of been that for like the past 100 or so years, you know, like looking at the trajectory of like the modern state project and like who kind of makes up its upper echelon, who makes the decisions and things, like that all has some relationship, which, you know, I think like, just say like similar to trying to tease this out, establish differences where there are some distinctions where they may be necessary. It doesn't just have bearing, I guess, on like the world of science, even insofar as that has bearing on the world of governance directly, in that they kind of rely on some form of statistical expertise to make decisions, but also like, you know, our very idea of like what the world is, the society is, the things like that, like how that all is, and the way in which those ideas kind of serve as like self-justifications for their continuance, no matter what, you know, also is kind of like related to this in the sense that I think Rescher would say it's all like one thing, or at least it's all feeding into each other, whether you like it or not. Like, even though you've committed yourself to some small subset of things thinking on, and you kind of hope that you can just make that perfect and not worry about other stuff, and some, like, you know, like those walls will not stand because everything is kind of like informing everything else when you talk about systems of knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's right on, right? Like, you know, lots of us thought we were just studying physical science, but, you know, the material implied our own cage, you know, and we just couldn't apprehend that until, you know, now we're living in it. It's very obvious, you know, the way that this is coming to pass now, and you know, I think probably. The term might be biopolitical, you know, the biopolitical ramifications of this kind of thinking, of this kind of causal explanation user. Yeah, we've got to stop them, we've got to combat them. And, you know, from our little garden redoubt here. Yeah, we'll hopefully be outlining some more thoughts along that in this marginal form by two marginal thinkers. So thank you very much for joining us. This is some Marginalia.
Hi ho, hi ho, hi ho, hi ho, hi ho, hi ho. Hi ho, hi ho, oh our Lord, let us look in the pages of your book. Hi ho, hi ho, hi ho, hi ho. Times of knife, sin and strife is the message of my life. Hi ho, hi ho, hi ho, hi ho. Angels high in the sky makes me see God when I die. Hi ho, hi ho. Hi ho, hi ho, years go by, I cry and sigh for the sins that I live by. Hi ho, hi ho, hi ho, hi ho, hills and trees on their knees, praising God, taking their ease. Hi ho, hi ho, hi ho, hi ho, Birds that fly, days go by, help me use my spirit's eye. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. Lonely lands, raise your hands, praise the Lord who understands. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. Sky intent, deep content, praise the prophet God has sent. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. I haven't got a dime, one more time. He is watching, sees my crime. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. A long straight road, a mountain load, I pray just where my spirit flowed. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. Wandering free, cottonwood tree, mountain sky, no door and key. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. No child or wife in my life, tent and pegs and hunting knife. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. Hill and stone, skin and bone, coyote howling all alone. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. And all this air's filled with prayers, I breathe your name, forget my cares. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. When I'm done, the setting sun will still tell me that you are one. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. I'll be a slave in my grave, a dead man now, don't misbehave. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho. Lord, I cry beneath your sky, keep me faithful when I die. Hi-ho, 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 hi-ho.